dear foodie friends, and welcome to Kitchen Chat. I'm your host, Margaret McSweeney, and I'm so glad you're joining me here in the beautiful and award-winning Viking and La Cordoue showroom at the Merchandise Mart, here with my fabulous co-host, Chef Jamie Larita, who's a brand ambassador of Viking.
That's right.
And I am so glad you're joining us because we have a really fun guest today, Andrew Friedman, who is a prolific author and has this intriguing and compelling new book called Chefs, Drugs, and Rock and Roll. And you take us behind the scenes of life as a chef. Welcome to Kitchen Chat.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's so good to have you here. I love how the arc of this book, it's really a coming out party of chefs in terms of how they were really stuck in the kitchen for a long time and the evolution of bringing the chef out of the kitchen and onto TV, into becoming an integral face of the restaurants.
Yeah.
And how many chefs did you interview for this?
I don't have it broken down by chefs and non-chefs, but I interviewed about 210 people.
Wow.
Over about 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah. It was fun.
Wow.
It was fun. Most of them in person, so a lot of travel.
Yes.
Came to Chicago to interview the late Charlie Trotter.
Yes.
12 visits to California, about a half dozen each to northern and southern. Florida, Boston. Yeah.
All over, and
Yeah.
with the key Wolfgang Puck and Barbara Lazaroff and Thomas Keller, Jonathan Waxman, Alice Waters.
Well, what I really wanted to do with this book, because I didn't feel like anyone had really done it, is I felt like the story of the specifically American chef,
Yes.
which really did not exist pre-1970. You know, it was almost unheard of that a kid from a good home in this country would turn to their parents one day and say, "Hey, Mom and Dad, I think I might want to be a cook."
Right.
You know, that was like, I mean, and when they did do that, it was like their parents thought they were throwing their lives away. I mean, and often throwing away a college degree or maybe even a graduate degree or a law career. Yeah. You know, these were all what we would now call career switchers.
Sure.
And I'd always felt like the story of the chef evolution in this country had always been sort of thrown in the blender with the story of the food revolution in this country, and had always gotten a little bit lost. But I really felt like there was this compelling story to be told of this first generation or so of American chefs and what they went through to become that. Before you could see fame and fortune on the horizon and book deals and television shows and product lines and empires of restaurants, these people literally just wanted to be cooks. I mean, they wanted to cook.
Yeah, and I resonate with that, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the name of your book. I remember being an 8-year-old in a big Italian family and feeling really comfortable in the kitchen and wanting to cook. I mean, that's what really drove me into my career. It wasn't I came up through the 80s, and it wasn't a thing. You know, celebrity chefs were really not a thing. You had who was there? You had
Paul Prudhomme was known.
Paul Prudhomme.
Yes.
Wolfgang was starting to be known.
Right, and Julia Child, of course. You know, I used to watch her on TV as a child. But when did that start? It was in the 90s, wasn't it? When celebrity chefs, the fame thing.
You know, it depends who you talk to. There are people who feel like it started in the 80s. I guess that's how you define fame, right?
Right.
Was being on a magazine cover fame.
Right.
You know, was being on Good Morning America once in a while, as Wolfgang was, fame.
Right.
If so, it started in the 80s. Was having your own television show fame? If so, then I think you go to the early 90s. The Food Network was founded in 93.
Correct.
And I think changed everything. My book ends very deliberately in 1993 with the coming of the Food Network, which I feel marked, for better, for worse, for both, marked the end of an era.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
And changed the whole industry.
So people, when they see the cover of your book and they look at it and they see, chefs, drugs, and rock and roll.
Right.
What's the name about? And explain
the name for me. Well, first of all, I mean, it came to me one day. Just driving around, actually at a tennis tournament in Indian Wells, California, and on a Saturday morning at a red light, and this title, I don't know why, it just popped into my head.
I get that.
It's catchy.
Ran home, Googled it, couldn't believe there hadn't even been an article with that headline.
Right.
At least not one that's Googleable. And to me, that title very much, obviously, it's a play on sex and drugs and rock and roll, which is that famous phrase, which to me evokes the 70s and the 80s, which is when the book is set. But you know that they're definitely, you know, people in this time started to talk about chefs as rock stars. That was a term that got tossed around.
Right.
Made sense to me. You know, the drug piece of it, I expected the book to be a little more wild than it is. Not that I would celebrate that stuff, but I expected maybe cautionary tales and maybe some recountings of some wild nights, you know. People were much less open about that than I thought. I thought there'd be a statute of limitations.
Right.
And I guess I think people are so guarded and media trained and managed these days.
Right.
You know, there's a book I love called Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, which is the story of the American film directors of the 70s. I wanted this book to look at chefs the way that book looked at filmmakers. And that book is really no holds barred. People on the record telling these unbelievable stories. I thought I was going to get the same stuff. I couldn't. And that's okay. The other interesting, though, piece about the drug element is, and I think this gets overlooked, and this is in the book, is I think for a lot of the people involved in this story, it was of a piece with the times, and I do think that is a part of the reason why this story happened. I think, you know, you had these young kids who were growing up against the backdrop of Vietnam. There was the whole protest society. These were people who did not want to grow up and become their parents, you know, who didn't want to grow up and put on a suit and tie and go to an office. And I think the drug culture of that time is part of that.
And also the food culture, which I
Yeah.
love, and that's where my heart is in this story.
Yeah.
And because it all begins really with the French chef, and even you go back to Paul Bocuse, his story, and
Yeah.
his parents didn't want him to be a
Right.
chef, and
Right.
then how the French chefs had this great prestige. I'm sure you experienced that
Oh, yeah,
a lot too,
absolutely.
Jamie. And just really the American chefs finding their voice and breaking through and gaining that respect and doing things differently but still using the French technique,
Right.
but in their own way. Who do you feel was most influential in making that happen?
Well, I think you have to look at it regionally, or at least in the main hubs of where the story took place. So I think in California, there was much, especially in LA, which I think is a criminally underrated food city historically. I think now it's getting its due. But, you know, people, it was sort of anything goes. There was a lot of experimentation happening. You know, Jonathan Waxman, who was people think he was the first chef, but he was the second chef of Michael's Santa Monica. You know, he talks about doing experimental food, knowing sometimes that as soon as it left the kitchen, it was a mistake, but having customers who were so eager to be part of this whole thing that they were willing to be guinea pigs and willing sometimes to eat something that wasn't a home run. I think on the West Coast, there's a lot of people I would put in the category of game changers. You know, Jonathan Waxman, Wolfgang Puck, Jeremiah Tower, I think in a huge way.
Oh yeah, Jeremiah Tower.
I mean,
For sure.
Jeremiah.
I remember Jeremiah Tower was an inspiration. You know, you don't hear his name that
Not as
often.
much, although he's very much on the PR road these days. He's doing
yeah.
a lot of festivals. There was a documentary about him called The Last Magnificent that came out about 1.5 years ago.
Oh, I have to catch that.
But what he did at Stars, even what he did when he was at Chez Panisse,
Right.
was really just outside the box thinking. And then on the East Coast, I think you had a much more of a sort of adherence to the French background you're talking about. You know, the East Coast was where people would go to the Culinary Institute of America or go overseas and do what they called a stage or an apprenticeship in a French kitchen.
I did both those things.
Right. So it was sort of like people, I feel like much more on the East Coast had to go through a stage of sort of adhering to the doctrine and then breaking out of it. So you had someone like Charlie Palmer, who was an early chef at the River Cafe,
I loved that.
but had come up in French kitchens like La Côte Basque, but then started applying, as you said, French technique to traditional American flavors, his version of dishes. before Charlie, Larry Forgione, who was the original, not the original. There's always in a lot of these restaurants an original chef who no one's ever heard of, and then the one everyone's heard of. So Larry was actually the second chef of River Cafe, but he would take, regional American food, apply the technique he picked up at the Culinary Institute of America, and working at the Connaught Hotel in London, and working in France for a short period of time, and apply those techniques to dishes that he would pull out of cookbooks. One of my favorite little footnotes in the book, it's in there, this story, he became friendly with James Beard.
Yes.
And he would go to what is now the Beard Foundation headquarters, James Beard's house, on 12th Street in New York City, and they would pull cookbooks off the shelves and talk about dishes. And Larry got a lot of his ideas from those times with James Beard.
I love that, and also I think of Larry Forgione as a forager, because was he the one that would call call Indiana and ask for?
This is another big difference
these
between
hickory nuts.
Yeah, this is again, California. You could get. There was already a lot of agriculture happening, and a lot of access to great ingredients for chefs. Not the way it is now, but on the East Coast, Larry, having come from the European kitchens, having seen farmers coming to the back door, with freshly killed rabbits and whatever, and baskets of mushrooms. And Larry had grown up hanging out at his grandparents' farm on Long Island. And he had this epiphany, which is so obvious. These stories seem very quaint in hindsight, right? But his epiphany was, I know there's this stuff in the United States, but why don't we have it in restaurants? Why are we getting stuff shrink wrapped in plastic? Why aren't we dealing directly with farms? And he, at one time in his career, he told me he spent half of each day, basically sleuthing out ingredients from around the country. Getting on the phones, looking for mushrooms, for hickory nuts, for you name it. Not just finding the person who could provide it, but this was pre-FedEx. So Larry would then also have to figure out how to get it shipped.
Wow.
And when he was at River Cafe, the owner...
Think about that. That's very interesting. Pre-FedEx, pre-internet,
pre-internet is amazing. So, people today can go on a purveyor's website, a young cook, and pick from dozens of microgreens, right? Here you had somebody like Larry cooking in a really esteemed restaurant, but wanting to elevate the game, right? And so he would figure out how to get things shipped, and then Buzzy O'Keefe, who to this day owns the River Cafe, a couple times a week would send a van to JFK Airport to pick up all this stuff that was flown in the cargo holds of these airplanes. That's how they got a lot of their food.
That's crazy to think about.
But that's what it took. I remember giving a talk to a group of restaurant cooks when I was working on the book. They asked me to come in and give a little talk about what I was working on. And I read from this Larry interview, and I read what he would go through to put his hands on stuff, and their jaws were on the floor. It's really, if you're, south of maybe 35 years old, this is almost unimaginable.
It is unimaginable.
What people had to go through.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really. I love your passion. You're very passionate and extremely informed. It's.
You spend 5 years on something.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
Thank you.
It's refreshing.
And I love too, Jamie, how in the book you really give credit to our friend Barbara Lazaroff for being a very key player in terms of making the success of Wolfgang Puck's empire and Spago. And,
well, we should say Barbara is Wolfgang's now ex-wife.
Yes.
Who met him when he was the chef of Ma Maison, which was a real sort of CNBC Hollywood canteen, I guess you would call it, back in the 70s. And then the two of them together went on to do Spago and Chinois and some other restaurants together. They've been divorced for a while now. But Barbara had a background in stage design and theater, and is also a big personality. Dresses.
Yeah, she's impeccable. She's so fashionable. We actually celebrated Barbara here in the Viking show.
Barbara is responsible for the look of those restaurants, which was revolutionary at the time.
Yes.
And a lot of people, to different degrees, will tell you, that Wolfgang was much more reticent early on, and that she sort of helped push him out into the public and had a real vision for what he could be as a celebrity. To different degrees, different people will tell you that.
So let me ask you a question. So that was the past, and we talked a lot about the present, but what do you think the future is for these, you know,
For the profession, for chefs themselves?
Yeah.
Excuse me. So here's my crystal ball thought. I think
I like
that, you know, there's all these, okay, so if you go back, I love this example. You know, you look at someone like Jonathan Waxman, who got known doing these stripped down, what a lot of people would call California cuisine. You know, he's famous for a roast chicken with French fries, right? That was a signature dish. It's still amazing.
Who doesn't love that?
He still serves it.
I could eat that right now for breakfast.
So Jonathan, you know, got famous for that kind of food. And then you have someone like Thomas Keller, who's famous for these very intricate, fussy, you know, French-leaning dishes.
And he didn't go to culinary
Well,
school.
so this is the punchline, right?
Oh, sorry.
No, but of the two, Jonathan went to La Varenne cooking school in Paris. Thomas did not go to cooking school. And I think back at that time, those two looked at each other as peers. They operated in very different styles, but they were peers. And in fact, it's another funny footnote is Jonathan's the one who was driving around the Napa Valley one day and saw that this restaurant called the French Laundry was for sale, and called an out-of-work Thomas Keller in LA and said, I think I found a place for you to do your thing. And that's how that happened. That's a true story.
Oh my goodness,
but
I love that.
my point is that those people, I think, most of the people in this story saw themselves as equals, okay, to some extent. I think what's happening now is with the different types of businesses available to people, I think we're going to see a stratification. I think it's already happened, just nobody's named it. You know, so because of food trucks, because of these places that just do one thing, you know, like hot chicken, right? Like there are places that just do that. There are places that just do steak sandwiches, right? Now you don't have to have gone to cooking school for that, or even have much training if that's all you're doing. But all these people call themselves chefs, you know? So I think there's going to become the equivalent of like a single subject chef. I think there's going to be a pop-up, or whatever that's going to be called at some point. Someone who basically is nomadic, who doesn't have a restaurant, who only does pop-ups. And then I think you'll have the traditional, I can't tell if you were agreeing with this.
No, I'm thinking about it. I'm
I'm
downloading. Yeah, I agree with you.
I don't know that they'll all be called chefs even.
Right.
You know, and I think
Well, you know,
we're at this moment now where the landscape is changing dramatically, and I don't feel like the terminology has caught up to it yet.
Yeah, I think in certain cities, like the restaurant bubble has bursted, number one. And I feel like the whole, in my opinion, I feel like that whole celebrity chef is kind of, it's being diluted a little bit by a lot of the things that you're talking about. And people today, with the speed of, again, the internet and information and lack of time, I feel that I'm watching a lot of these big, you know, box food companies that are bringing people back into the kitchen. So to me, I like what you're saying because I'm starting to see some of that, but I'm also starting to see a trend of people utilizing these, you know, recipe box packaging kits companies, and that's, for me, I'm always trying to bring people back into the kitchen, especially here in the showroom. We talk about the love of food, and I felt like that has become gone by the wayside. You know, I grew up with having this big Italian family that always, you know, my grandmother, those were the food memories and the taste memories that I have, and I feel like there was a generation of where that didn't happen.
Yeah, you had two career parents, right? Two career families, kids fending for themselves. Food was really just fuel, right? It was utilitarian. It was just, I need to eat.
Yeah, something you had to put food on the table because it was like something, especially if it was fast. But I feel like that energy has dissipated, and for me, I've been working really hard on educating people about, you know, that energy is so important. And I feel like that is, I like your point, and I do agree with you on that. But I am also seeing I'm answering my own question, but I'm also seeing people going back into the kitchen, which is interesting to me.
And the other interesting thing too, I love your perspective on that. You know, in the book you talk about how the restaurant critics from the New York Times and all of that really shaped the chefs. What do you see in terms of that? I mean, everyone seems to be a critic these days. Has that been changing the dynamics of
Literally,
of
right?
what-
You mean
Yes.
what I call the civilian reviewers of Yelp and
Oh, then you have the food influencers that are on, like, Instagram, and
Huge.
they're taking pictures of food, and do they really know food?
Well, this could be a whole nother interview because I think the power of social media is good. It is a way to be noticed, but I also think there is a whole generation of certainly of diners. I don't think of critics yet, official critics, people who write for the magazines or newspapers or websites, but I do feel like there is a generation of diners for whom what the food tastes like, you were talking about the love of the food a minute ago, is maybe third or fourth down on the list of priorities. Before that comes, does it look good does it look cool?
Right.
Is there a shock value? Forget whether or not it actually tastes good, but is it something I've never had before? Did I notch that, did I notch that on my Instagram belt? It's interesting. And there are people, I believe, I don't believe, I know this because I've had these conversations. I just recently did an interview for my podcast with Justin Hilbert, who's the chef of Maud in Beverly Hills, which is one of Curtis Stone's restaurants. And he was very open about it. He said, people want that image, and I can give them that image and still cook good food. But that is now more of a consideration for somebody like him than it was maybe 5 years ago, right? And if you notice, there's restaurants in New York, and again, the food can be great. There's a restaurant I love called Wild Air. It's a wine bar. Their platings are very, they're not composed most of the time. It's food that looks really good from above. It grams really well.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, and it's some of the best food in New York.
It's so interesting, because now I'm thinking about, and I'm going to go there when I'm back in New York next week, but it's funny when we talk about gramming and, putting that, I find myself when I'm plating, there's an extra 2 to 3 minutes at the end that I have to exude that energy upon the plate. And that's also what people are consuming. Does it charge the plate more? I think so. Because to me, it's all about, that energy. Everything you touch, everything you think about, does that plate become more delicious?
Right.
Instagrammable energy.
Yeah, but the flip side of this is I've had conversations with young chefs who have a lot of anxiety now.
Oh, yeah.
Because the flip side of that is, let's say I want to run a special, and let's say it tanks, right? Well, what if somebody with a huge following is in for dinner that night, Instagrams it out, says it's a failure? No, 2 different chefs have said this to me in interviews in the last 6 months, that actually restricts them, constrains them creatively, maybe not in their head, but what they'll actually let out the door or off the pass, right? And they'll hold back a little and play it a little bit safer, right? And I think that's too bad. You contrast that with the thing I was saying about Jonathan Waxman years ago, who once said, that he could serve his customers anything on a given night as long as it's not the same thing they had the night before.
Right.
Incredible.
I don't think that's where we are now. I think that's why I can only speak to New York in this way because I live there. But there is a lot of sameness in the food in New York. Eater, the website a couple of years ago it was very funny. It was every trendy New York restaurant menu, and it was a full menu. And it did basically seem like the menu of half the restaurants in New York.
So give me your top three restaurants in New York.
What occasion? I always have to ask what occasion.
Just from a delicious perspective. Like where you go, where your go-to.
Go regularly? Well, right now, I'll give you at the moment, I love a Chicago graduate, Missy Robbins, who used to be at Spiaggia. Her restaurant, Lilia, is one of my favorite restaurants. I love that restaurant, and I've been on the record with her that's right now probably my favorite restaurant. I just went to a new restaurant that opened this year called Frenchet, which is Riyad Nasir and Lee Hansen, who for years were the chefs at Balthazar. They're graduates of Daniel Boulud's flagship restaurant. And it is a phenomenal, fun, sexy restaurant with just incredible. As soon as I saw the menu, I knew what I was going to order that night. The top thing in the entree section was duck frite.
Yum.
And it was just the most perfectly roasted duck breast, with a big thing of fries and béarnaise sauce and a little sauce boat. And it is absolutely killer. And then Alex Stupak, who has the Empeon Mexican restaurants, his Midtown restaurant, which is sort of his fancy one, I just think he's brilliant. I think he's, people may know Alex started off as a very sophisticated pastry chef. He was the opening pastry chef of Alinea here in Chicago. And then he was the pastry chef at WD50 in New York City. And then when it came time to do his own thing, he pulled this move that everyone thought was crazy and went to the savory side and started doing Mexican food. There are reasons for it. We don't have time for that right now, that it made sense. And his third, and I think, I don't even want to say most successful, but the most ambitious is this restaurant in Midtown, which from the cocktails to the starters to, and then he kind of gets into his playground with dessert and does the stuff along the lines of what you might see at an Alinea on the dessert side. Those are three. There's many others, but those are the ones that pop to mind. And I have to throw in Barbuto, which is my perpetual go-to, which is Jonathan Waxman's, I think at this point, classic West Village restaurant.
Absolutely. So in a nutshell, can you share with us your culinary journey? Have you always been a foodie, and what brought you into this journey?
So the nutshell version is, I have not always been a foodie. I grew up in this polar opposite of your childhood. I grew up with a single working mom who would come home exhausted. As often as not, dinner was a bag of Wendy's that she would pick up on the way home. It was understandable. I always loved restaurants, though. I came to New York for college, and I quickly, whatever I could afford to go to, I loved a good restaurant, whether it was high end or low end. Just a restaurant where you walk in and it's kind of humming and there's a vibe. And I was in college in New York in the '80s. It was a great time to be starting to eat a little bit. I wanted to be in the film business. And was. But what I really wanted to do was write. So I stopped writing screenplays, decided I was going to try to write other things. Took a day job with a PR firm, a job I found in the New York Times, and it happened to be the top restaurant PR firm in New York. And all of a sudden I was representing Alfred Portali at the Gotham Bar and Grille, and Marcus Samuelson when he became the chef at Aquavit when he was 24 years old, and Rocco DiSpirito when he opened Union Pacific, who actually cooked my wedding. My wedding was at Union Pacific. And Alfred Portali was getting ready to do his first cookbook, and he was my client. We were friends. I often, because I was a pretty good writer, would help him and other clients. I would write speeches, letters. I didn't really think of it at the time, but it was a form of ghostwriting. And it's a much longer story than this, but I ended up co-authoring the Gotham Bar and Grill cookbook, which is the first thing I ever got paid money to write. And at the time, I didn't even own a cookbook. How it happened is bizarre. But I had a great time. And so within a year of that book coming out, I jumped ship on my job and I started going to all these chef friends and acquaintances and letting them know my shingle was out as a collaborator. And I started doing that. I thought by now I was going to have sold a screenplay and I'd be living in the Hollywood Hills, so that didn't happen. And somewhere along the way as a collaborator, I realized, or I felt like, I had become sort of an expert about chefs. I knew a lot of them. I'd spent a lot of time in kitchens. I'd heard their stories. I'd written their stories. I didn't feel like anyone had really carved out, like I refer to myself as a chef writer, not a food writer. I don't write recipes. I'm not a cook. I write about these people.
And this is incredible.
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
On Kitchen
One of the most
Chat.
interesting kitchen chats I think we've had.
Absolutely.
This could go on for hours.
I know. Well, to be continued. We'll
I
have
hope
to,
so.
and we'll make sure. And what is your podcast?
Oh, my podcast is called Andrew Talks to Chefs.
Great.
It's deep dive biographical interviews with chefs. It's on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, easy to find.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.
Being
Thanks for
on
having me.
Kitchen Chat. And thank you, dear foodie friends, for joining us in the Viking and La Cornue showroom today here with Chef Jamie Larita. Come visit him in the Merchandise Mart and grab a copy of Chef's Drugs and Rock and Roll. I'll make sure I have a link. Visit me in my kitchen, kitchenchat.info. And always remember to take a moment and savor the day.